Perhaps the biggest question when it comes to energy policy is, how do we tackle three key competing priorities: reducing emissions, keeping energy affordable, and above all, ensuring energy is reliable? Often, these priorities seem to be at odds. At EPSA, we believe a price on carbon gets us moving towards progress on all those fronts. Applied regionally in power markets, it can achieve billions of savings and cut emissions in half. Applied across the US economy, it can have an even bigger impact. And applied globally, that would be a real game changer. This is Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories and trends behind America's changing electric grid. In this episode, we're looking at how leaders on the global stage are addressing energy solutions. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's President and CEO. Our guest is Lord Gregory Barker, also known as the Baron Barker of Battle. He's a business leader, a member of the United Kingdom's House of Lords, and was recently named co-chair of the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Lord Barker brings an international perspective to the conversation, with business perspectives from his seat as the executive chairman of the N+ Group and policy insights from his visit to COP26 in Glasgow and his work with the CPLC. Lord Barker, first, let me thank you again for taking time to visit with us today. We're very excited to have you join us. For those that may not know you, can you walk us through a little bit? Tell us a little about yourself, how you became involved in energy and climate policy, and why it's an important issue for you.
Sure. Well, I began my business career in finance and energy. So when I went into British politics way back in 2001, it was sort of natural for me to lean towards energy issues combined with my political interest in environmental issues. And I began what then became a 15-year passion for green issues. I was a member of the British Conservative Party. So it was climate change and environmental issues were somewhat of a minority sport amongst my group, which gave me free rein to dig in. And I subsequently became, under Prime Minister David Cameron, the UK Energy and Climate Change Minister, before in 2015 having decided that I'd had my fill of politics, as much as I had enjoyed it, as much as I'd enjoyed actually being a minister, I went back to the private sector and subsequently became chairman of the N+ Group, which is the world's largest producer of low carbon aluminium. Aluminium, of course, being vital for the climate transition. And we're in 12 countries, over 100,000 employees. So it's a big lever. And if I can make a difference here with this big global company, I'm still getting the satisfaction of being in business, but at the same time making a real difference on the climate agenda, which I still care passionately about.
I think that's incredibly helpful background. And as you know, you've got experience both in the aluminum sector, but also the hydropower world, which kind of puts you in the perspective of being a very large consumer and also a producer of energy. So I think that's a bit of a unique perspective that you have. Has that shaped your views on energy and climate policy about both what's needed and what's possible? Or is that just another function of your evolution from your time in Parliament?
Well, you're absolutely right. I omitted to mention that the N+ Group is also the world's largest private sector hydro power company. To put that in context, we have about 16 gigawatts of hydro within the group. And if you think that the Hoover Dam is 2 gigawatts and we've got 16, that gives you some idea of our size. And that's also bigger now than the whole of the UK's nuclear reactor fleet put together. So it's a very formidable clean energy resource.
Sure.
And certainly, hydro is much overlooked in the climate debate, and I think will play a very important role alongside all of the other exciting new renewable technologies that are growing so fast.
You were recently appointed co-chair of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us what that is and what its goals and objectives are?
Sure. So the CPLC which is a slightly clunky name for a coalition of both governments and private sector companies who are showing leadership on the climate agenda and want to put carbon pricing front and center of that policy drive. So the members range from the UK government, Sweden, Canada, through to companies like BlackRock or Unilever, big, and indeed now the N Plus group. So big industrial companies as well as investors from around the world.
And how do you view the issue of carbon pricing? And I ask that for a couple of reasons, one of which is EPSA supports an economy-wide price on carbon here in the United States. We think that's the most efficient approach for us to try to address emissions using economic tools to help us get there. As you are probably well aware, it is not exactly politically favored at the moment, but our members continue to support it in a number of organizations. The Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition does the same. So why is it that you believe carbon pricing is the right tool, and why do other policies not quite measure up to that?
Well, firstly, I think one of the things that carbon pricing has suffered from in the past is people have been very purist about it. It is undoubtedly, I think, if you talk to the majority of economists, the most effective tool available to policymakers to drive the transition to a low carbon economy. But it's not just about economics, it's also about fairness. If you pollute, you should pay for that pollution. But and with that's whether that is some noxious gas, but also whether that is carbon, and I think there is an increasing recognition that the polluter should pay. But there are social and business costs related to carbon emissions that certainly aren't typically priced into the value of everyday products or services. And so we need a policy that actually puts a price on carbon, because the market won't do it for us, at least not at the scale that we need in order to drive the change we need to see if we're to control man-made climate change. So it's really important that we have a carbon price that drives companies, drives business, drives investment away from high carbon polluting activities, incentivizes new, exciting, clean technologies. But the key, I think, and perhaps why it's been politically unpopular in the past, or perhaps hasn't taken off in the way that it should, given it's such an effective economic tool, is the politics around it. And what it does raise revenue, and that revenue comes from ultimately from consumers, from the public, from voters. And you've got to ensure that if you're going to take revenue, that you then have a policy to compensate those who don't have any alternative, or are going to incur greater costs in finding an alternative to using or burning fossil fuels. Put bluntly, if your heating bill is going to go up, or your cooling bill, or your gas bill for your truck or your car, if you are a typical average family, or a typical working class employee, you've got to be compensated for that to help you do the right thing. Countries around the world are doing that now. Canada is a very good example, where literally they've started ramping up the carbon price, but where people get a check at the end of the year to compensate them. And by and large, the typical middle-class family do better as a result of the carbon price and the check that they receive than they would otherwise. And so it's proved politically acceptable across the aisle, which is great, because this should be a bipartisan issue, not just in the States, but around the world. Obviously, the big gas guzzlers, multi-home households, people with very large houses that consume lots of heating and cooling, they will end up paying more. But by and large, a well-designed carbon price shouldn't penalise the typical middle-class family, and that is why politicians need to be really thoughtful about the way that they implement the carbon price, and why in their jurisdiction. So I'm not a believer in a one size fits all. There will be different applications of carbon price depending on the country or the community that it's aimed at. But the underlying principle that you should put a price on dangerous carbon pollution to drive investment away from fossil fuels and into exciting clean areas of the economy has to be right.
And I think you highlight an issue that we completely agree with, which is the need for this to be a bipartisan issue. Because in the end, it's our view that energy shouldn't be a partisan issue, regardless of which side of the aisle you may be on. It really is our goal to ensure reliable, affordable power, and in a way that reduces emissions.
And actually, if you look back at the history of energy in the 20th century, until very recently, not just in the States, but right the way around the world, energy was a bipartisan issue. This wasn't something that involved great controversy. And certainly in the UK, I'm glad to say, as in many other countries now, the shift to a low carbon economy is also now bipartisan. There's not an argument about whether this is the right thing to do. Everyone's agreed a shift away from fossil fuels has to happen. There might be some debate, discussion about how effective the government of the day is in driving that change, and also concern to make sure it doesn't disproportionately hit certain communities, certainly not those on the lowest incomes. But overall, the direction of travel towards a low carbon future is something, I have to say, that's moved forward a great deal, even in the last couple of years. Because if you look at the countries, in the very different countries, everyone from Switzerland, Singapore, and communist China are actually all signed up in principle to this, even Saudi Arabia.
We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about U.S. energy policy, and I'm glad that you've kind of brought the global perspective, because it's a global issue. What trends are you seeing in the UK and some of the other countries that you've mentioned that you're involved with when it comes to support for the carbon price?
What happens when you get huge disparities? Because what you can't allow to happen is the laggards, those who aren't going to make the change quickly enough, you can't allow them to have a competitive advantage by doing so.
Right.
So Europe has woken up to this fact. The UK has woken up to this fact. And if you look at what's happened over here, the UK now has reduced its carbon emissions from a 1990 level by nearly 50%. It's something like 48%. It's astonishing. The UK now produces fewer carbon emissions than it did when Queen Victoria died. I mean,
Okay, that's a good benchmark.
Right back to the 19th century. Still a long way to go, and it's going to get harder. Likewise, other countries in Europe have also made good progress, not quite as good, but have made good progress in doing that. And that has prompted the European Union to ask this question: are we starting to put companies that put a price on carbon at a disadvantage compared to others who are exporting from outside the area, from other parts of the world, like China,
right,
where there isn't a high price on carbon, and so they're using cheap coal to, particularly in energy-intensive industries, to send their exports into a market, and they're not paying. They don't have the same cost base. As a result, you've got the European Union coming forward with something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Basically a tariff wall designed to tax imports based on their carbon content. Now, that's a very complex thing to do. I mean, the principle has to be right, but the reality is it's full of unintended consequences. And whether you go too fast or too slow, it suits some, not others. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is one way of doing it. I've got another way that I personally prefer when it comes to international trade, and that is green free trade. there are already lots of tariffs on lots of industrial products, consumer products, certainly the US. What we ought to be doing, in both directions, is going for green free trade. So saying, look, we're not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Let's just zero rate green goods and services while we work out how to price in at the border carbon. So you could do that very quickly, and that would actually be a real fillip for US business, because it would make it cheaper to turn products green. And we do know that many of the big products that underpin the new low carbon economy, like electric vehicles or sustainable packaging, renewable energy infrastructure, all of these things actually have a very global supply chain. Very few companies or even countries can actually procure everything that they need in their own backyard. It does require a global supply chain, but we should be looking for green free trade to make it easier and cheaper for companies to switch out high carbon ingredients in their products for low carbon. The other thing that negates the need for border tariffs is a carbon price. If you start to align carbon prices between markets, then that actually also reduces the need for tariffs. And tariffs are never a good idea. They might be necessary, but by and large, business hate tariffs, not just the amount you have to pay, but because of the added bureaucracy, the friction, the difficulty of doing business. The easier you can make it for people to trade with each other, the more growth will respond. And by having a simple price on carbon that is comparable, doesn't have to be the same, but is comparable in the standards of the way that you measure carbon, is comparable in some way to the price paid in different markets, the less need there will be for tariff barriers at frontiers. So, when you can think up quick fixes, but if you're really looking to bend the curve, carbon pricing, it keeps coming back as the answer. So
I will say your second point raises a second question, which is hearing the thoughtful way you're approaching the carbon price question. What would you say to the holdouts that are either uneducated enough about the issue and don't know which way they should come down on it, or are fundamentally opposed for political reasons? How would you try to persuade those folks to at least understand the perspective from which you're trying to approach this issue?
First of all, talk to business. I was very fortunate to join a high-level conversation at COP26 in Glasgow of leading American businesses, and I think every one of those business leaders came down firmly in favor of a carbon price as their number one ask of the US government. Quite surprising, and these were very right across a whole range of different sectors. I think what business wants is long-term certainty. So if I was a policymaker, I would, number one, talk to business and talk to the people who are creating jobs, talk to the people who are supporting communities economically, and look for those businesses that are responsible and have a real future, and ask them what they think is going to work for them. Because perversely, often you hear politicians say, well, we're not going to support this because it will be bad for business, when in actual fact, business is making the argument. Secondly, it's the unintended consequences on the consumer or the public. And there, keep it simple. Don't, when you're going for a carbon price to begin with, don't overload it. Make this a gradual proposition, over a significant number of years. Don't overload it. They tried that in Australia 10 years ago, it never got off the launch pad. In fact, I saw it here. There in the USA, when under President Obama, there was an attempt in Congress to put together an energy bill with bipartisan support. I remember Senator Lindsey Graham being a key proponent of an energy bill which included a carbon price. But I think in the end it ran to nearly 1,000 pages, and it just was too much of an ask. So keep it simple. Don't be over complicated in its implementation, or be too ambitious at the get-go for what you're asking to do. I think I said at the beginning that I'm a pragmatist when it comes to carbon pricing. And you have to be pragmatic in making sure you understand the consequences for the average consumer, as well as the consequences and unintended consequences on big business. But if you don't start and you haven't got a clear long-term vision,
right,
you're never going to get anywhere.
Right. I'm curious if you can just educate us a little bit, as we, of course, are watching the stories about price increases for energy in Europe this winter. Does that impact people's thinking about the cost impacts of a price on carbon?
Well, of course it does. It does make it more difficult to make the case for a carbon price in an environment where people are worried about the current cost of energy.
Sure.
Obviously, the current cost of energy, the price spikes that we've seen recently in Europe, have been driven by supply shortages. But fundamentally, it doesn't change the fact that businesses and consumers need to have certainty around long-term pricing.
Sure.
And that you get from a carbon price. You don't get from the volatility that you're seeing currently in gas markets.
Well, you mentioned in a previous comment about your attendance at the COP26 event. And so, of course, we're interested in a couple of things. What did you hear there from other attendees and participants? And what messaging did you share? And then really, what were your key takeaways?
Well, first of all, the fact that this huge meeting actually took place is a big tick. Right up until the fall, many people were still questioning whether or not the UK would be able to host a climate summit on that scale. So the fact that it happened and was well organized is in itself is encouraging in the time of COVID. I think it's also fair to say that many people were calling this, whether or not this would have any sort of successful outcome right until the finish line. In actual fact, we managed to get a fair outcome for COP. I think John Kerry says when most parties are uncomfortable with the outcome, you've got a good balance. And I think that's where they've come out. It could have been more ambitious, but certainly enough progress was made for it not to be a failure. And that's very important. And the direction of travel, again, has been reinforced. But for me, the standout from COP26 in Glasgow was the unprecedented private sector business engagement with the whole process. I mean, there have always been companies who've turned up to COP, and I've been attending these in various capacities for over a decade. So having business there isn't new, but it's the range, the breadth of the businesses that turned up. Historically, it's just been, those who had a low carbon novel technology to flog, or maybe those who were personally very committed to the agenda, people like, visionaries like Paul Polman of Unilever, for example. But by and large, the majority of the global economy were not represented. Whereas now you really felt that there were a lot of companies there, not because they were green evangelicals or because they'd had some overnight conversion to environmentalism, or even had some radical technology to sell, but because they had come to the conclusion that it was a far greater risk to ignore the changing world towards a low carbon economy, a much bigger threat to their business model not to be getting on board with the climate movement than to basically stay at home and try and ignore it, which is what most have done before. So I did see an unprecedented number of what I'd call mainstream regular businesses, consumer facing, business facing, B2B facing, all trying to work out how they could make an effective transition to a low carbon way of doing things.
Okay.
But again, let's not, I never get too carried away with about any one text or any one conference. It's the direction of travel, what we used to call in politics the big mo.
Yeah.
I just sense that the momentum is towards the low carbon economy.
Noted. I think that's helpful. So let me close my series of questions on COP with this. From a number of perspectives, as you note, it wasn't maybe as ambitious an outcome as you had hoped that it would be, but it did make some steps. What are the next actionable steps? I mean, what are the tangible progress items that we should be looking for between now and, say, the next COP event, or now and just pick your date certain, 2030, 2040, as we look to try and address some of the issues that attendees were focused on?
Very simple. They've talked the talk at COP. They have signed on the line for the most part. What we really need now is to do the doing, if I can coin a phrase. It's all going to be about implementation of the plans that have already been agreed. Now we need to ratchet down those plans even further, but plans are just plans. They're meaningless unless they actually correspond to the real economy. And I think there will be increasing urgency now and focus on those economies which are not doing their bit to fulfill the commitments that they've now made. And we live in an increasingly transparent world where everyone has access to so much information. We are benefiting increasingly from technologies, including AI, which makes sense of so much information in order to turn it into actionable data. It's going to be very difficult to duck out of the fact that some countries, some economies are not making the progress they should. But that's a good thing, because it then means that we can address that and bring pressure to bear, or bring the finance to bear, or address the underlying causes. Because in some cases, it's not for a lack of will, but maybe it's a lack of investment. Maybe they lack the right technology. Maybe they lack the right industrial partners. Maybe they lack the vision. There's a whole number of reasons. We mustn't always think it's a bad reason or deliberate on the part of economies or countries to follow the low carbon path. But increasingly, this thing is a snowball. There is unstoppable momentum. The question is, will it be enough? Will it be change at a pace and scale that is going to keep global warming to below 2 and ideally below 1.5 degrees? And at the moment, it's really not clear whether it's going to be enough. It's certainly happening, which is great for someone that's been involved in this agenda for such a long time, when so little appeared to be happening on the global stage. It's happening now. It's just, will it be fast enough?
Is this maybe the lever that helps the carbon price discussion move beyond the theoretical and into the practical application on a very broad scale? Absolutely.
When I was at COP, I hosted a discussion with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada under the World Bank CPLC banner. And we brought together the head of the World Bank, the head of the IMF, the head of the World Trade Organization, and the president of the European Commission, and the UN head of finance, Mark Carney, climate finance. And everyone agreed that actually you need these institutions, particularly those Bretton Woods institutions in Washington, to come together and work out the most effective way to drive this agenda forward. We now have over 60 countries that have some form of carbon pricing mechanism. So it's not like we're starting with a completely blank sheet of paper. What we need to do is create out of this disparate ecosystem something that is much more coherent. But I think that's a lot easier to do. I'm a lot more optimistic that you can do that now that so many countries have begun to go on this carbon pricing journey, that we can encourage them along and out of all these disparate parts make something much more coherent and ambitious.
That's one of the most optimistic descriptions I have heard about how we might be able to tackle the issue, and certainly want to open the door for you for any last comments that you might want to make around carbon pricing or energy in general, or how we can effectively create policies that are going to address the concerns that are so vital as we go forward.
Well, I think I've pretty much exhausted it there, Todd. Thank you. But I would just simply say carbon pricing, historically, it's been a bit of a nerd's favorite economic tool. It's actually the most effective thing that, if done pragmatically and sympathetically, it actually brings together business. It could bring together consumers and climate activists on a bipartisan basis, right across the aisle, as the most effective way to ensure that we do beat dangerous man-made climate change and do actually have a future to pass on to our kids.
Lord Barker, I appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today. It's certainly been a pleasure to chat with you. Your insights have been incredibly helpful, and we're grateful that you took time to be with us.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Todd.
You can find more information about carbon pricing and other energy policy recommendations on our website at www.epsa.org. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. If you liked this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're also happy to answer your questions or take ideas for new episodes. Send them to press@epsa.org.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.